This evening we are concerned with the Bodhisattva vow and the quality of mind that it represents, which is termed bodhicitta, or the enlightening attitude. It should go without saying that this enlightening attitude, this quality of bodhicitta, is absolutely essential to attain enlightenment. Without this quality of mind, this compassion and altruism, it is impossible to attain complete enlightenment. It's as simple as that. Before the Buddha Shakyamuni attained enlightenment as the Buddha Shakyamuni, before this bodhisattva began the spiritual development which eventually resulted in complete enlightenment, at one point the Buddha was a sentient being like the rest of us. And in fact, at one point the Buddha's consciousness, or the consciousness of the being that would become the Buddha, was in a hell realm, as a hell being, suffering intensely from the karmic tendencies which had brought the mind to that state of hellish existence. And in this particular incarnation, the Bodhisattva, the future Buddha, was a hell being who, with another hell being, was forced to pull an extremely large load in a kind of large chariot or cart that was loaded so heavily that the two of them could barely pull it. And all the time they were being goaded and whipped and beaten by the fiends of hell to make them pull this cart, these demons. The word in English we would use is a fiend. It refers to a being in hell that is not really a sentient being. It is a projection of the hell being's karma. The hell being thinks that this demon really exists, but it is really just a projection of the mind of the hell being. However, they had this experience of being beaten by these, what they thought were these beings or these demons that were beating them and stabbing them and making them pull this heavy load. And at a certain point, the thought occurred to this one hell being that would become the Buddha in the future, and this being thought, why should we both have to suffer? It's all right if I suffer, but supposing this other being here, my companion here, can rest, does not have to go through this suffering. And so this hell being turned to the demons and said, let this other one go. I'll pull the load myself. At which point the chief demon, the main figure that was goading them, became very angry and said, how can you alone pull a load that two of you can't pull now? And taking a huge axe or hammer, he smashed this hell being on the head, killing the being. And the mind was immediately freed from that state of hellish rebirth and attained a precious human existence in the next rebirth, because of that quality of bodhicitta, that quality of compassion for that other being. Now that was the first moment of bodhicitta in the mind of this being that would eventually become the Buddha. And this was the start of a long progression of rebirths, some 500 in lower states of existence and 500 in higher states of existence, before the Bodhisattva finally attained enlightenment as the Buddha Shakyamuni. But without that quality of compassion, that whole development would never have started. So this quality of bodhicitta, of compassion and altruistic concern for others, is absolutely essential for any true spiritual development to take place.
내가 썸마서 것은 신주 산재나 팬다다비에 아드는 성제도 전지 정보만 그래 주는 번에 신주도 산재도 담아라는 그러나 다른 좀 자주 뿐지도 팬 제가도 제가 다시 하자 아까 같은 말씀 그다음에 정치습니다 말하기라스 담마트 집까지 가면 되잖아 다다 담아서 만들라 근데 만들 집아 서자지만에 그 집까지 말이스 나라요 또 소리 해자지만에 이제쯤 되면요 바빠로 아야네 와니 사모 따로 집아 저기 생각 담아듯이 말이스 근데 소자 서자지만에 바빠 삼바 통에 인연을 쓸때 자세서 집아라 정치습니다 담아듯이 말이스 대체자 자신 저지 사모 따지는 집까지 근데 만져라 또 말이스 다 뒤노네 그냥 다시 저기 서사를 들었다마 나나 또 가보는 말이지 근데 사마 따질 때 대바도 성취지 상 제가 시작했어요 근데 난 좋지 말아야 그랬더니 나서 있잖아 판도 쳐봤다 되고 제가 말이지 근데 대답이 담아지 와라 근데 자라고 사놓고 담았고 그랬대 그만 제가 또 말이지 이나요 근데 가르쳐 봐야 될 때는
If the benefit of simply giving rise to this attitude spontaneously is so great, it is magnified by a kind of formalization where in the presence of a spiritual teacher and in the presence of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, one formally takes the vow to work for the benefit of all beings. And this becomes a commitment that one makes to oneself to develop this attitude of compassion and altruism. With that kind of commitment and that kind of intensity to the commitment, then it becomes even more strong in one's makeup. And the blessings that one receives from that quality are even more profound. And this is what the context of the ceremony tonight, the Bodhisattva vow, is involved with. The taking of this commitment in the formal presence of a spiritual teacher and in the presence of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions, one formally takes the commitment to work for the benefit of all beings. Now, there is a lineage associated with the Bodhisattva vow. In our particular age, in our particular times, this dates from the 4th Buddha of this Kalpa, Shakyamuni. There are 2 main lineages of the Bodhisattva vow. The first of these passes from the Buddha Shakyamuni through Manjusri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom, to the Indian Buddhist master Nagarjuna and his student Aryadeva, and so on, in a lineage which has remained unbroken to the present day. This is what is termed the lineage of profound insight. There is another lineage which passes from the Buddha Shakyamuni through the Bodhisattva Maitreya, the Bodhisattva of loving kindness, and through the Indian Buddhist master Asanga, Vasubandhu, and again, down to the present day. This is known as the lineage of extensive activity. So both of these traditions are accessible in the world today. We as practitioners could receive either the lineage of profound insight or the lineage of extensive activity for the Bodhisattva vow. However, there is a difference in practicality. For the lineage of extensive activity, which comes through Maitreya, this is only traditionally given to someone who has some level of ordination, either layperson's ordination, or monk's or nun's ordination, or novice's ordination. And so it is a little more restrictive. It is only really given in a situation where someone has already taken at least the lay precepts, or a novice nun's or monk's vows, or fully ordained monk's or nun's vows. In the case of the other lineage, that of profound insight, it is open to anyone who wishes to take it. Providing the person has basic faith in the Buddha Dharma and has taken refuge, then that person may receive the formal transmission in the true sense of the word. That person has opened themselves to receive that transmission if they wish to take it. So the only requirement, so to speak, for the Bodhisattva vow according to this lineage, that of the lineage of profound insight, is the faith and confidence in one's own mind, in the three jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and the compassion for other beings, that is the spirit of the vow. If one has those two qualities, then anyone may receive the transmission. Now, no doubt, everyone here has received the refuge vow at some point or another. But in the ceremony itself, there is again the taking of refuge, even though one may have taken it before with another teacher in another time. The reason why the ceremony includes the taking of the vow of refuge is because it is so important, because it is so fundamental to this attitude, to this transmission. Now, one doesn't have to go through the whole ceremony of having the hair cut and receiving a name and so forth as one did the first time, but nevertheless, at this point, one formally retakes one's vow of refuge as the first part of the ceremony. Because whether we're talking about the extensive activity or the profound insight lineage, there must be this basis of the taking of refuge, this faith and trust in the three jewels, in order that one opens oneself for the transmission of the blessing. During the ceremony, one should not consider that one is only in the presence of the particular teacher or spiritual friend who is giving the transmission. That is one aspect. There is the physical situation, which is that one is physically in the presence of someone who holds this lineage and is able to transmit it. The spiritual friend, who in the Mahayana sense is one's advisor, one's source of advice, and gives one teaching, in this case the transmission of the Bodhisattva vow. There is the spiritual situation as well, that one is also in the presence of all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and that one should consider oneself in the presence of the sources of refuge, the three jewels and the three roots, all actually present in the space before one. So that during the ceremony there is not only the physical presence of the spiritual friend, there is the spiritual presence of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. The first part of the ceremony is the taking of the vow of refuge, which is the introduction to and the basis or support for the Bodhisattva vow. So the ceremony begins with everyone rising and performing 3 prostrations to the throne in the presence of the teacher and in the presence of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and these 3 prostrations constitute the formal request. One is, as one prostrates, one is showing one's respect and asking for the transmission. Then after that, one kneels in the traditional posture. The right knee is on the ground, the left knee is up, and the hands are folded during the recitation of the refuge vow. At this point, the spiritual friend says the words of the refuge vow, a few syllables at a time, and one repeats the syllables after the teacher. This refuge vow will be said a total of 3 times. The first recitation is done with the understanding that one is taking refuge, requesting the vow of refuge for the benefit of all beings. The second recitation, that one is making a connection that one intends to keep in the future, that one will not reject in the future, but will cherish as something precious. And the third recitation, with the understanding that completing this final recitation completes the transmission, and at that point one has received the vow of refuge.
公司色，
到了，
罗本到了，
公司色，
公司色，
印度，
大明的，
At this point, one repeats one's name.
是这位中，
谢绝为中，
在那中的，
杜德尼松的，
中之宁波七十八路，
上车宁波切切巴，
这弄了小村桥，
三界南拉插斯基，
中去381，
中车三车三百亿，
徒劳我得见小村桥，
索拉扬的宣插斯基，
出这那具备，
小车那修备，
东，
三界东，
中去380，
中车三百，
中去到了，
tam界到了，
公司收入，
公司色，
到了，
罗本到了，
公司收入，
公司色，
民族。
大明的。
Again, one's name at this point.
是这位中，
谢绝为中，
在那中的，
杜德尼松的，
中去宁波78路，
上车宁波切切巴，
中去弄了小村桥，
三界南拉插斯基，
上去381，
首长上车三百亿，
我带进小村桥，
索拉扬的宣插斯基，
出这那具备，
小车那修备，
中去东，
三界东，
中去380，
上车三百，
也到了，
tam界到了，
公司收入，
公司色，
也到了，
罗本到了，
公司收入，
公司色，
到民族。
大明的。
Again, one's name.
谢绝为中，
在那中的，
杜德尼松的，
中去宁波78路，
上车宁波切切巴，
这弄了小村桥，
三界南拉插斯基，
中去381，
车当上车三百亿，
做了我带进小手一桥，
索拉扬的宣插斯基。
把经理叫成功当把头擦胸上过的是。
At this point, one should realize that one has received the transmission of the vow of refuge in the Mahayana tradition.
哦，一套也喏，
So,
One can now sit as normal.
啊，从这层的干嘛工作的是？从这层的干嘛就完了。 salon de trop já tinha corridas, e na salon de trop já tinha tudo, né? Então que ele tá com molana, tá, já que você não tá batendo, cala de coisa que tinha histórias. E lá é, salon já tinha salon só corridas. Então, tá canela sana, acaba de montar a ação de tanto tempo. 다다 해마 정치선의 까라 정보 하나 정치의 까라 빼나 성질을 내고 저는 자변으로 지나 자변 그 빼면으로 지나 자변 그 빼나 저는 자변 그 예타이 사사 데모 저것이 가지고도 초마는 펄네 정치의 산실은 담보와 근데 나서 말했어 근데 저것이 내가 신고법지, 자처법지, 들려풀네, 정치도 산지도 담아지고 나서 야레스. 다시 자, 나서 다를 때는 배가 오이나, 그는 소소, 마치 애매도 때는, 초마서 다잖아, 그는 차지 건다네. 그래, 이마 가시오, 해는, 그래, 결국에 제바도, 된den발은 해깔아서 자기 친구를 사는 거 가지고 써야 말했어. 근데 나타나서 때는 뭐가야 말했더니 또 생각이 생기는 거로 좀 인정이 좀 쳐봤으면 안 되겠어.
This brings us to the actual transmission of the Bodhisattva vow. In order to thoroughly prepare oneself to receive this transmission, it is necessary to generate a great deal of merit and awareness. Now, this quality of merit is something which has already been reinforced to a great extent, or we would not have the precious human rebirth that we do. The fact that we are in this superior state of rebirth means that there has been a great deal of merit and virtue in previous lifetimes, which has reinforced the positive karmic tendencies that led to this state of rebirth. But this is not something which stops at this point. It is something one continues to augment, continues to develop, particularly in the context of receiving the Bodhisattva vow. Eventually there will be 1,000 Buddhas that will appear during this kalpa, this particular age. 4 of them have already appeared, the Buddha Shakyamuni having been the 4th. In the case of each and every one of these Buddhas, at some point in the past, these beings first gave rise to bodhicitta, first gave rise to this thought of working for the benefit of all beings, and at some point formally took the Bodhisattva vow in the presence of Buddha. And it is this which started them on the process of development that will result in their attaining enlightenment during this kalpa. Now, in the case of some of them, they were extremely wealthy and powerful individuals, like kings or rulers. And they would offer their entire kingdom. All of their power, all of their wealth, everything was offered in order to receive the Bodhisattva vow. Some of them were very poor and had nothing to offer but a handful of grass or a small bundle of firewood. But that was what they offered, and that was how they received the transmission of the Bodhisattva vow. It is the sincerity of heart that is important. In Tibet, it was the custom that when a group of people were interested in taking the Bodhisattva vow, they would get together for 3 days beforehand and spend those 3 days making offerings and prostrations, rendering service to the Sangha and so forth, to develop their merit and prepare them for receiving this transmission of the Bodhisattva vow. Now, obviously, we can't cram 3 days of activity into one evening, but it is largely a mental attitude. And so one could perform the same kind of offerings and accumulate the same kind of merit through one's mind, through one's attitudes, and that is sufficient to prepare one for the Bodhisattva vow. At this point then, one still is considering oneself not only in the physical presence of the spiritual friend, the teacher who is bestowing the transmission of the Bodhisattva vow, but in the spiritual presence of the 3 jewels and the 3 roots. All of the sources of refuge gathered in an enormous assembly in the sky before one, in the space before one, and one meditates on the actual presence of the sources of refuge as well as the physical presence of the teacher. And it is in the presence of all of these sources of refuge that one proceeds to develop one's merit and awareness to prepare oneself for the Bodhisattva vow. At this point, the words that Rinpoche will be reciting is the ceremony of invitation, inviting the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, the 3 jewels and the 3 roots, to be present during the ceremony. At this point, one meditates that in the presence of these sources of refuge, one first offers homage, which is shown physically through 3 prostrations, and mentally with the attitude of faith and devotion. So at this point, one then offers 3 prostrations to the physical presence of the teacher and the spiritual presence of the sources of refuge. The next stage is that of making offerings. And during the recitation that Rinpoche will be reciting, one can focus mentally upon this particular stage of making offerings. When we say making offerings, we can understand it on three levels. There is, of course, the material sense, where one offers actual flowers or candles or bowls of clear water or whatever on the shrine. This is one aspect of offering. Another aspect is the visualized or mental aspect of offering, which is really limited only by one's imagination. Anything worthy of offering can be mentally created. One can create a mental image of that and consider it an offering. One can meditate gods and goddesses, beautiful and handsome, emanating from oneself and carrying in their hands anything that is beautiful to look at, any sound that is beautiful to hear, any smell that is fragrant, any taste that is delicious, any texture that is soothing and gentle. All of this meditated or visualized aspect is a form of offering as well. And there's another aspect of offering which simply is considering the natural beauty that exists in the universe as an offering. The flowers and fruits, mountains, streams, forests, sunsets, and so forth. Anything which simply exists as part of this world we live in, without being made by anyone in particular, without belonging to anyone in particular, simply there to be enjoyed. All of that can be considered an offering as well. So during this particular recitation, it is this concept of offering, material, visualized, and the offering of natural beauty, all of this that is taking place. And one's attitude in this sense is of making offerings of all of these things. At this point, one meditates that in the presence of all of these sources of refuge, the three jewels and the three roots, one is acknowledging all of the faults and shortcomings, all of the negativity, all of the obscuration and ignorance and confusion that has been generated and developed in one's mind from beginningless time up to the present. All of this being the obstacle to one's attainment of enlightenment. At this point, all of this is openly acknowledged and confessed. Having prepared oneself in this way, with a profound development of one's merit and awareness, one is receptive to the Bodhisattva vow. First, one should understand the context of the Bodhisattva vow. The Bodhisattva vow is concerned with the quality of mind that we term bodhicitta, the enlightening attitude. Now, there are several aspects to this quality of bodhicitta. The first of these is an attitude of aspiration. It is the aspect of feeling in oneself that one is taking this vow, that one is practicing the dharma, that one is engaging in whatever one does for the benefit of all beings. That basic aspiration is one kind of bodhicitta. Then there is the attitude of application, of actually carrying that through in daily activity, in meditation practice, in whatever one is doing. And the actual application of that, so that it is not simply one's aspiration, but one actually does it. One not only aspires to do it, but one actually does it. The actually doing is another aspect of bodhicitta, which is termed the aspect of application. So to begin with, it is important to understand that there are these two aspects. There is the aspiration to do something, in this case to work for the benefit of all beings, to enlighten all beings. And on the other hand, there is the actual application, to actually go about doing that. So, first and foremost, it's important to understand that there are these two aspects. Bodhicitta can be understood in two ways, as a kind of aspiration and as an application as well. To take a very simple example, perhaps one wants to go to India or some other country. First one thinks, I want to go to India. That's the aspiration. Then one goes about getting the money, getting the ticket, getting the visa and so forth to actually go there, and one actually starts on one's journey. That's the application. So there are the two aspects which are necessary in any action, and especially in this quality of bodhicitta, the aspiration to do something and the application of carrying it through. Another way to examine bodhicitta is to consider there is a relative aspect and an absolute or ultimate aspect. The first of these is compassion. The relative aspect of bodhicitta is the compassion that one develops towards all beings. The ultimate aspect is the experience of shunyata, or emptiness, the experience of the true nature of mind and all phenomena. Now, perhaps it might seem that one should first speak of the relative aspect, compassion, because this quality of compassion has an intensely purifying effect, and the more one generates this compassion for all beings, the more one is purifying one's mind of kalpas, of accumulated negativity and obscurations and confusion and so forth. And as this purification takes place, the mind becomes more able to see the true nature of mind itself, to see the nature of emptiness. So, on the one hand, it may be that one leads to the other. But we could also reverse that and say that to first understand the nature of mind is to have even more compassion for beings who do not understand that nature of mind, because one sees, as much as one realizes the nature of mind itself, one sees that it is the ignorance in the minds of other beings that prevents them from having that direct experience, which causes all of their suffering and confusion in the first place. So this gives rise to even greater compassion. So one can lead to the other. On the other hand, the other can lead to the first one. And so these two aspects, absolute and relative, are an aid one to the other and supportive one to the other. The ultimate or absolute aspect of bodhicitta is first and foremost the understanding of the nature of mind. The third Karmapa Rongjung Dorje, in one prayer, the Mahamudra prayer, said regarding the nature of mind, it does not exist because even the Buddha cannot see it. But on the other hand, it does not exist because it is the source of all samsara and nirvana. It is the foundation for all enlightened and unenlightened experience. But, he said, this is not a contradiction. To say that it neither exists nor does not exist is not a contradiction. It is at one and the same time existent and non-existent, without being one or the other. And this is what is known as the middle way, or the middle view, which avoids falling into the one extreme or the other. And so, in speaking of the nature of mind, emptiness, Rongjung Dorje spoke these words of the prayer, that one cannot say mind does exist because there's nothing there that one can see. On the other hand, it is the origin of samsara and nirvana. So to say that mind exists in a naive sense, or to say that it does not exist in a naive sense, are both incorrect statements. It is at one and the same time existent and non-existent. One could describe it in either way, and in fact it is neither of them. The only thing we can say is that mind is essentially empty. Once one has understood the nature of mind to be essentially empty, one experiences the projections and the appearances that present themselves to the mind as partaking of that same intangibility, that same emptiness. And this is what is meant when the texts speak of seeing all phenomena or experiencing all phenomena without attachment and without considering them to be ultimately real, but seeing them like the moon reflected in water. The image of the moon reflected in water is used because we have an example here, a very obvious example, of something which is and is not at the same time. Of course there's no moon in the water. No one would go looking for the moon in the water. But at the same time, something is there. Something's perfectly apparent and easy to see. And in the same way, when we experience any phenomenon at all, we are experiencing something that is very apparent to the mind, but doesn't have any ultimate reality of its own. One wouldn't go looking for anything that is really there, simply an appearance that appears to the mind very clearly due to a certain set of circumstances. And so one begins to experience the appearances and phenomena that the mind experiences as illusory or dreamlike. Now, as this realization of the nature of mind and the nature of phenomena begins to grow, so does one's compassion for other beings who lack that realization, because one sees that that lack of realization is the cause of so much suffering, so much confusion. Once one has seen the illusory nature of all experience and the empty nature of mind, there's no need to continue wandering in samsara, and there's no need to continue suffering and experiencing the consequences of that. But one's compassion for other beings who are still caught in that delusion increases automatically. There's no way that it cannot when one sees directly for oneself what the problem is. So therefore, with the development of this ultimate aspect of bodhicitta, the relative aspect of compassion develops automatically, spontaneously.
근데 다 그저 성질이 상이 비자 저거야리 이저 상태가 시작이 괜찮지만 내가 믿지도 믿지라 저런 비지 선 마시고 나빠도 뭐냐 주지 뭐 참아 비지 선 내가 그래 나서 가르잖아 사자석에 더 많이 봐라 나는 내가 차진지 같이 말했어 이런 맛이 저는 뭐한테 편지 내가 짜는 말이지 너무 찌빠지 같이 찌빠면 돼 내가 선 내가 하지 말았어 거기에 나서 또 그런지 맞지 짜는 내가 대마시는 따빠를 쏘네 절대는 뭐지 다시 다 대답에 등하면 설정도 다시 이렇게 쏘나 그는 설정 좌절 설이나 이제 시스가 제일 거였어 대답 대주사
Regarding this quality of compassion, which is the relative aspect of bodhicitta, this term needs to be defined because it's very often misunderstood. It's oversimplified. Compassion is not particularly sitting and thinking, oh, you poor person, to another person, oh, you poor fellow. That's not necessarily compassion, particularly if you're somebody little and humble, looking up at somebody who's rich and powerful and influential and saying, oh, you poor person. It's kind of difficult to really give rise to sincere compassion. You don't really feel pity in that kind of situation because the person has all the advantages. That's not what compassion is based upon in this Buddhist sense of the word. What it is based upon is an understanding of the basic nature of sentient beings. Big or small, high or low, whatever situation a being is in, there are some fundamental mistakes that we all make, that each and every being makes, that cause us suffering. The first of these is that we continue to experience a self or an ego as something real where there in fact is no such thing, ultimately speaking. Because of that, a great deal of our suffering develops. Because of this need to defend and protect the self that doesn't exist. Another way in which we suffer is by mistaking things which are only conventionally real for things which are ultimately real. All of our experiences are really like dreams or illusions. They have no ultimate reality because they do not last. They don't have any life of their own, so to speak. Just as a dream, when we wake up from a dream, the dream is finished. It had no ultimate reality. When we die, this world disappears. It had no ultimate reality. But we invest all of these things with some kind of ultimate reality in and of themselves, and we treat them as though they existed in and of themselves. That's another problem that we have. That's another source of a great deal of our suffering and confusion. And finally, we are continually regarding things which are impermanent as things which are permanent. All that we experience is impermanent, is unstable, is always changing and breaking down and fading away and dying and so forth. But we're always treating it as though it was absolutely stable, something we could depend upon. That's another source of our suffering. Now, once one has understood the basic situation of being a sentient being, an unenlightened being in samsara, then one has a basis for true compassion, because one's seen that the suffering arises from looking for a self where there is none, looking for truth where there is none, looking for stability and permanence where there is none. Those are the mistakes we make. Regardless of our particular situation, we all make those mistakes and we all suffer the consequences. Then one can really discover true compassion once one's understood how all beings make all of these mistakes.
나도 신의 그런 첫 파티서 시야데 나도 나치 소마 시야데 치mon데 와스 커로 가지 버티 시스만 그거게 말스 다시 했더니 똑같다는 특전 지탱을 좋아했을 때 문제들이 있어 파샤 사기 많아도 주는 저희 반차 남의 더 보는 거 치러 가놓고 말스
In addition, of all of these infinite numbers of beings in the 6 realms of samsaric existence, there is not a single one that has not been one's father or one's mother, one's parent at some point in some lifetime, throughout this infinite cycle of rebirths. In fact, each and every single being has been one's parent not once but many times over. And the only problem is that our ignorance prevents us from seeing that. The parents do not recognize the children, nor the children their parents. That karmic connection is not seen because we are limited by our ignorance. But there is this connection. During the time of the Buddha, one of his most famous disciples was an arhat named Katayana. And at one point, Katayana was out begging for his food one day, and he came to a house where there was a young woman sitting in the front yard, and she was holding her young baby in her lap, and she was eating a fish. And a female dog came along and started bothering her, could smell the fish. So the woman picked up the bones and the rest of the fish meat that she had not eaten, and threw them at the dog, and told the dog to get lost, to beat it. And started to scold the dog, and the dog, of course, was busy eating the fish and chewing on the bones. Now, Katayana was realized to the point where he had some kind of clairvoyance or psychic power, and he could see the karmic connections that existed between these different individuals or these different beings. And what he saw was that the young woman's mother and father had died previously, and that the mind of her father had taken rebirth in this fish, in this rebirth as a fish. The mind of the mother as this female dog. And that her worst enemy, she had had someone in her life that she'd hated very much and who had had a very great deal of anger towards her as well. And this person had died, and the consciousness of that person had been reborn, conceived as her child, and reborn as her child. So when Katayana saw this, he was completely appalled, and he said, to see someone eating their father's flesh, beating their mother, scolding their mother, and to watch a wife eating her husband's, chewing on her husband's bones, and to see somebody holding their worst enemy as though they loved them so dearly. He said, when I look at that, samsara is just so completely absurd.
저기 진짜 거부고 있어서 성질을 집안에 그래 다처럼 저기서 가는 전체 무슨 말이지 잡아 가이나 근데 남바는 나를 진짜 생각나대 내 말을 쳐주시나 가이는 선 근데 성질이 나잖아 근데 결국은 나한테 진짜 성질이 됐어 근데 나서 가르쳐 성질 집안에서 어떻게 남바는 저런 저처럼 산하는 저런 저처럼 다시 또 저런 저처럼 나빠는 말이지 뒤는 진짜 무슨 저거이나 이제
Through appreciating that all beings have been our parents, we have a basis for developing compassion. And when we understand the karmic process, we have even more of a basis for developing this compassion. One understands that the more powerful and the more influential someone is, the more worthy they are of your compassion. Because wherever there is power, there is corruption. It involves some kind of unskillful activity somewhere. It is very difficult to hold power purely. And what that person must do in order to maintain that power, to get that power and to maintain that power, is to create a lot of negative karma, which means that in the future their mind will be pulled down by this negative karma towards some lower state of rebirth and further suffering, further confusion. So in the moment it might look like the person is doing fine, but actually when one sees the karmic situation, one understands that they're very worthy of one's compassion. The same can be said for wealth, because wherever there is wealth, there is greed. It is very difficult to have wealth and to keep wealth without being greedy or avaricious. During the time of the Buddha, there was a monk in the region of what is now called Varanasi or Benares in India, who had absolutely no interest in worldly wealth, was completely committed to his spiritual practice, but was given at one point a fabulous gem, beautiful jewel that was worth a fortune, the answer to anybody's dream. And this monk thought, well, I don't need this, I don't have any use for this kind of thing, I should give it to somebody who really can use it. And so he started thinking, there were a lot of poor people in the area, a lot of beggars, a lot of paupers, people who didn't have any wealth at all, and he kept trying to decide who would be the best person to give it to. And he really couldn't decide, and so he went to the Buddha, who was staying in that area, and he said, I found this, or I've been given this fabulous gem, but I don't really need it, I don't really want it, and I want to give it to someone who really needs it. Tell me the person who needs this wealth the most. Tell me the person who really has the need. And the Buddha said, give it to King Saja. And the monk thought this was very strange because King Saja was the wealthiest person in the whole area. He had more wealth and power than anybody could dream of. The last thing he needed was one more gem. But the Buddha said, no, I insist, give it to King Saja. You said, give it to the person who needs it the most. So the monk thought, well, the Buddha must know what he's talking about, and he went and he gave this jewel to the king. And the king was very surprised to find this Buddhist monk giving him this incredible jewel, and he said, where did you come by this jewel? What are you giving it to me for? And the monk said, well, it was given to me, but I don't really need it. And I asked the Buddha who would need it the most, and he said to give it to you. So the king was rather puzzled at this, and he went to the Buddha for a personal audience, and he went into the Buddha's presence, and he said, one of your monks just came and gave me this incredible jewel, and he said that you had told him to give it to me because I was the one who needed it most. And I'm wondering if you can straighten this whole thing out and tell me what's going on. And the Buddha said, well, of course you're the one who needs it the most. You're the most wealthy, but you're also the most greedy person in this area. All that this wealth has done has made you greedy and avaricious, and all you want is more and more and more. You don't have any contentment. So when he asked me in this situation, I took him literally. The person who needs it the most is you. So just because a person is wealthy does not mean that they're in a good position. Because in getting that wealth and in keeping that wealth, a great deal of negative karma can be generated. Which means that just because a person is powerful, just because a person is wealthy, seems to be superior in the ordinary sense of the word, doesn't mean that that person isn't worthy of one's compassion. In fact, even more than ordinary people, those kind of people are worthy of our compassion. All beings experience a subtle level of suffering, which is the suffering of simply being alive, of simply having a physical body. This in itself constitutes a form of suffering that one cannot escape from. This is something which all beings are subject to. In addition, depending on the particular realm of existence in which the mind takes physical form, there are specific sufferings that are predominant. In hell realms, these are the suffering due to intense heat and intense cold. In the Preta realm, that due to hunger and thirst and deprivation. In the animal realm, there's the main suffering of predation, of one species eating another, and the continual struggle for survival. In the human realm, there are the sufferings of birth, of aging, of sickness, and of death. In the realm of the demigods, there is the suffering due to quarrel and fighting continually. And in the gods' realms, there is the suffering due to the fall from that state of splendor when the karma exhausts itself and the mind must fall to some lower state of rebirth. In particular, in the human realm, there is suffering due to the human condition, which is, on the one hand, a sense of restlessness, a continual busyness or restlessness, and on the other hand, a sense of deprivation, a sense of something missing, which we as human beings all experience. There is always the feeling, I need something else. This isn't good enough. I don't have enough to eat, or I don't have a nice enough place to live, or I don't have a good enough this or that. There's always something else one wants, something that it just isn't enough. We aren't satisfied. There's that, and then there's also the activity and the restlessness and the kind of neurotic behavior that we go through trying to satisfy all of those needs. And that is a real cause of suffering for human beings. That kind of neurotic, restless activity and that sense of want, that sense of need that is basic, seems basic or fundamental to being human. But in order to develop compassion for all beings, it's necessary to understand the sufferings that all beings are undergoing, to understand that beings are in pain, that there is this kind of suffering going on. Each and every being is in the same position. Each and every being wants to be happy. To be alive is to want to be happy, to attain some kind of happiness. But the causes of happiness are virtuous activity and positive activity that reinforces positive karmic tendencies. And that's not something that very many beings at all understand. In the same way, no being wants to be unhappy. No being really is doing anything than trying to avoid suffering and to attain happiness. But the causes of suffering and frustration are negative action, unvirtuous action, which reinforces negative karmic tendencies. And again, this is not something that most beings understand. So the situation is one where what we want and what we do in order to achieve it are in direct contradiction to one another. We simply do not understand how to achieve the happiness that we want, and instead we create all kinds of circumstances for further confusion and further suffering. So our action is at direct odds to our goal. Now, in all of these ways, one develops one's compassion for other beings. And when one develops this compassion and one truly wishes to help other beings, one realizes that the only way one's going to do that is to attain enlightenment oneself. Because right now one simply doesn't have the insight, one doesn't have the skill, one doesn't have the ability to help other beings on a very effective level. The more one attains towards enlightenment and realization, the more effective one becomes in helping others. So that is one's motivation for seeking enlightenment. That is one's motivation for practicing dharma. That is one's motivation for taking the bodhisattva vow. Because one is intent upon giving rise to this compassion and carrying it through in all kinds of bodhisattva activity. Vast ocean of bodhisattva activity, taking oneself and all beings towards enlightenment. That should be the motivating factor for one receiving the vow tonight. The actual ceremony begins again with 3 prostrations, which is one's sign of respect and also one's request for the ordination, for the vow. As one thinks to oneself, I am taking this bodhisattva vow, I am requesting and receiving it, not only for my own benefit, but to attain enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. Again, one kneels with the right knee down and the left knee up and the hands folded. During this recitation, one's attitude is that just as the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the past gave rise to bodhicitta, gave rise to this quality, and undertook this bodhisattva vow, that one is following in this example and that one is doing the same. And that furthermore, just as the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas did not simply take the vow but actually applied it in all of their bodhisattva activity, working for the benefit of other beings in many ways, one is intent upon applying this as well. So there is not only an aspiration involved here during the recitation, but also the promise to oneself to actually apply this attitude in what one does.
Chojana Jupe Sanje Dong Chanche Samba Tamche Dala Gonsa Sol Lopen Dala Gonsa Sol Da Mingde.
One repeats one's name at this point.
She Jue Jong De Dene Sumpe Jise Shangchu Ningpo La Chiche Badu Chitara Ngunji Deshe Chi Shangchu Tutne Chepa Dam Janchu Tsembe Papa La Deda Rinji Nepata Dejan Drola Bendundu Changshu Tsamne Cheche Shin, Deshin Dunle Lapa Laum, Rimba Jindu Lapa Ji.
During the second recitation, one's attitude is that in taking the Bodhisattva vow, one intends to keep it. One intends to respect this in the future and not reject the connection that one has made.
Shojana Jupe, Sanje Dong, Changshu Semba, Tamche Dala, Gongsu So, Lopen Dala, Gongsu So, Da Ming De, Xie Jue Chong, Du Dene Sung De, Jisi Shongju, Ning Bola, Cheche Bardu, Jitala Ngunji De Shek Chi, Chanchu Turne Je Padong, Chanchu Sembe Lapa La, Deda Rinjin Ne Pata, Deshin Dola Pendandu, Chanchu Tsimne Cheche Shim, Deshin Dune Lapa Lawong, Rimba Jindu Laparanji.
The third and final recitation is undertaken with the attitude that this completes the transmission, and one should have it very clear in one's mind that once one has finished reciting the words of the prayer after the teacher, that in the physical presence of the spiritual friend and in the spiritual presence of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and the sources of refuge, one has completely received the transmission of the Bodhisattva vow. This conviction is quite important.
Shojana Jupe, Sanje Dong, Changshu Semba, Sanje Dala, Gongsu So, Lopen Dala, Gongsu So, Da Ming De, Xie Jue Chong, Du Dene Sung De, Jisi Shongju, Ning Bola, Chichi Bardu, Jitala Ngunji De Shek Chi, Changshu Turne Je Padong, Changshu Sembe Lapa La, Deda Rinjin De Pata, Deshin Dola Pendantu, Changshu Tsamne Cheche Shim, Deshin Dune Lapa Lawong, Rimba Shindu Laparanji.
At this point, one should feel that one actually has received the transmission of the Bodhisattva vow in the physical presence of the teacher and the spiritual presence of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas.
Leso.
During the following recitation, one should have this kind of attitude. One understands that one has received the Bodhisattva vow, and one understands that this is the kind of this has affected a kind of significant change in one. This has really made one's human existence truly meaningful. One is now a bodhisattva. One is a son or a daughter of the Buddha. And one is attempting to live up to this ideal of the bodhisattva, one who works for the benefit of all beings as best as possible. So that one is committing oneself to always practice and always behave in a way which is in the spirit, in accordance with the spirit of this bodhisattva vow, and not to go against it and not to behave in ways which go against the vow, which harm other beings and create suffering and confusion. So during the following recitation, there is this recognition on one's part that a very significant change has taken place. One has received this bodhisattva vow in the presence of the Buddhas and bodhisattvas. One is now a bodhisattva, and one is committed to behaving in a way that is fit for a bodhisattva to behave.
Dindu datse drebo ye, mi sipa le prato, terin sanje riso che, sanje seso da denju, tane daki chine chang, rikdan tumbe le tsamde, chenme tsumbe rikde la, Nyopa minjo deta cha.
At this point, the teacher calls the attention of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and calls the attention of worldly gods and nagas who have sufficient insight to call witness to the fact that one has received the bodhisattva vow. So at this point the teacher recites a prayer which confirms in the presence of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and even of these samsaric beings who support one's spiritual practice. The teacher calls attention to the fact that one has received the bodhisattva vow and confirms this. During the following recitation, one should feel that the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, through their omniscience and compassion, are aware of this step that one has taken. They are aware of the commitment that one has made to the Bodhisattva vow, and this is pleasing in the eyes of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and one comes under their protection and their compassionate guidance at this point. One also feels that the gods and nagas of samsara who support spiritual practice are, in their own limited way, aware of one's intentions, and in a certain sense one comes under their protection as well on a more mundane level.
Dagi derin chopa tamche che, chengan rowa deshe nidane, dadang rola dundu zezenje, ladang lamin laso gawaranji.
During the following recitation, one is offering prayers of aspiration and supplication in recognition of the fact that one is now a bodhisattva, a masculine or feminine bodhisattva who has embarked on this path of the bodhisattva one aspires to give rise to bodhicitta where one has not given rise to it before, to preserve the bodhicitta that one has already given rise to, and to continue to develop that which exists so that it becomes deeper and richer. One is aspiring to always conduct oneself in a manner worthy of a bodhisattva, to fulfill the intentions of all Buddhas and Bodhisattvas through one's spiritual activity, and to lead all sentient beings to complete enlightenment.
Choncho Semde Rinpoche, Mache Panam Chejirechi, Chepa Nyamba Mepa Dong, Gonde Gondo Pelwaracho, Choncho Semda Mindra Ching, Choncho Chola Showa Dong, Sanje Namji Yonzo Ching, Tejin Rola Pendund, Choncho Semne Cheji Ching, Deshin Duna Hapa Lam, Sanje Namji Yonzo Ching, Deje Lenam Pongwara Sho, Choncho Semba Namchini, Gombo Duna Gondo Sho, Gombo Yene Gongomba, Semchen Namla Denjo Sho, Semchen Tamche Dedan Denjo Chi, Nyendro Tanche Tatu Tomba Sho, Choncho Semba Gondo Sarjo Pa, Deda Genje Mula Trupara Sho, Shenzhen Tamche Dewa Dong, Dunga Dudan Dembra Jochi, Dunga Dan Dunga Ji, Judan Rawara Chuchi, Dunga Mebe Dewa, Damba Damin Rawara Chuchi, Nidan Trache Nidan Drawe, Tonyan Chembola Nepara Juruchi.
One has now received the Bodhisattva vow. There are two basic ways in which one breaks one's Bodhisattva vow, or could break one's Bodhisattva vow. The first of these is what is termed mentally abandoning a sentient being. And the second of these is termed giving rise to an attitude which is against the spirit of the Bodhisattva vow. Now, to explain these, in the first case, it is not a case of one mentally rejecting or abandoning all beings, but even one. In any case where one decides about another being, that's my enemy. That person has nothing good for me and I have nothing good for them. If there's ever a chance to help them, I won't lift a finger. If there's ever a chance to save them from any trouble, I won't lift a finger. I don't care about that person, I don't want anything to do with them, and I don't want any goodness between us. I don't want to help them, I don't want to protect them from harm. If one gives rise to that kind of attitude towards another being, one has broken one's bodhisattva vow. This is what is known as mentally abandoning a being, simply rejecting a being. One wants nothing to do with that being. One doesn't want to help that being at all. That is one way one can break one's bodhisattva vow. The other way is if one loses one's courage. While one is practicing, one perhaps becomes discouraged. And one feels at a certain point, well, this is impossible. I can't work for the benefit of all beings. I'd better just work for my own benefit. I better take things much smaller scale. Let's forget about other beings and I'll just work for my own benefit. That is contrary to the spirit of one's bodhisattva vow. At that point, one has broken again one's commitment. Now, in the case of the bodhisattva vow, it is possible to purify oneself and to reinstate the vow in its purity. But what is important is to be very honest with oneself. Within a period of just a few hours, even 3 or 4 hours, one should be aware of such an attitude when it has arisen. If one has given rise to that kind of negative attitude towards another being, or if one has given rise to that kind of weak-spirited, discouraged attitude towards one's spiritual practice, one should recognize it and be honest with oneself and say, this is not appropriate. For someone who's taken the bodhisattva vow, this kind of attitude is simply not appropriate. I won't do this again. And just openly acknowledge it, completely purify oneself of it, vowing never to do it again, and reinstate one's original commitment. I will work for the benefit of all beings, for that being, for all beings. If one can develop that kind of attitude within a reasonably short period of time, then one's vow is not, it is broken, but it is not completely terminated. It is not completely broken. One can always repair it. In order to preserve one's bodhisattva vow and in order to develop it and enrich it, there are many kinds of advice which are given in the traditional texts. There are 4 basic attitudes which one should encourage in oneself if one's going to keep this vow and to develop it. There are 4 kinds of attitudes that one should avoid. There are 18 root commitments, there are 46 branch commitments, and so forth. One could examine it in a great deal of detail, far more than we have time for tonight. However, the Venerable Shangpa Rinpoche lives close by, and also the center itself is hosting many teachers who come through. And one can always ask these teachers, when there is more time, for a more elaborate discussion of the nature of the bodhisattva vow and the way in which one goes about preserving it and developing it. This would be quite useful, as a matter of fact, for people who are interested in understanding more about how this vow is preserved and how it is developed.
Dharma, dharma sakate, jala lepa jato jepa, tsara pongi pati tulis. Nonchon tutsani dharma sakate, jala pamba, konya pati, naka tajini pembi sarata dripu pati tulis. So what object of the dharma sakate, konde tanchi, yamani chambo peki pati tulis, that's not very obvious, that's not that. Shangpa Kagyu Shangpa Kagyu the gender Hiji Gala, Rome, Devada, Sension of Paratuato, Sajaka Dumato, the Baron Selamba, they did one of the conquerors.
In general, it could be said that the Hinayana level of practice and the Hinayana vows are to make one's life as harmless as possible, so that any action that is harmful or any action that could ever be the basis for harm to other beings is being eliminated from one's life. On the other hand, the Bodhisattva vow, the Mahayana ordination and discipline, is to make oneself as helpful as possible, so that everything that one does is helpful or is a source of help and benefit to others. And on the Vajrayana or Tantric level, one is concerned with seeing the identity of samsara and nirvana. of seeing the ultimate nature of reality. That's probably as concise as we could say it in examining the different levels of practice. On the Mahayana level of the Bodhisattva vow, which we were concerned with this evening, this quality of loving kindness and compassion is very important. One technique that one can use in meditation to embellish this and develop this compassion is what is called Tonglen in Tibetan, which literally means sending and taking. This is an attitude that one develops towards other beings of sharing one's virtue, one's joy, one's happiness, all that one experiences that is positive, one's merit. All of this is, as it were, sent out mentally to other beings and shared with other beings. And the suffering and pain and confusion and negativity of other beings is taken on oneself. So in order to develop one's compassion, this technique of Tonglen, of sending the positive and taking on the negative, is a very important one to help one develop this quality of compassion. The ceremony concludes with, again, 3 prostrations. This time one is expressing one's gratitude for the transmission that has taken place. One is showing the teacher one's gratitude for receiving the Bodhisattva vow. At the same time, the teacher will be saying prayers, Rinpoche will be saying prayers for the benefit of all concerned, with the very sincere hope and best wishes that each and every one of us can become a Bodhisattva in the true sense of the word. So, if people will take their seats again, Rinpoche will give the lung the transmission for the Ngundro practices. The first part of the text is concerned with what are called the ordinary preliminaries, or the common preliminaries. These are the four thoughts which turn the mind towards the practice of Dharma: the precious human birth, death and impermanence, the cause and effect relationship of the karmic process, and the sufferings of samsara. These are common to all the four schools of Tibetan Buddhism and to all traditions of Buddhism. They are called, therefore, the common or ordinary foundations or preliminaries. The special preliminaries, the prostrations and the taking of refuge and so forth, are slightly different in the different schools because of the slightly different lineages that are being prayed to or invoked and so forth. For example, in this particular case of the Karjupa preliminary practices, it describes the lineage that one visualizes, for example, when one is taking prostrations, and rather taking refuge and doing prostrations. In the center of the visualization is one's own root guru in the form of the Dharmakaya aspect, Vajradhara. And above one's guru's head, one's own guru's guru. And above that guru's head, that guru's guru, and so forth, up to the original Dharmakaya aspect, which was the original inspiration for the whole lineage. And so from Vajradhara to the Bodhisattva Lodar Rinchen, to Maitripa, to Tilopa, Naropa, Marpa, Milarepa, and Gampopa, and so forth, down to, in the case of the main Kagyu lineage, down to the 16th Gawakarmapa, Rongjung Rigpe Dorji, the late Gawakarmapa. Now, that is the main focus of the visualization, this main axis, so to speak, the mainstream transmission of the Kagyu lineage of Mahamudra teachings. However, there is a factor which distinguishes this practice from all other practices, and those of you who have read the book called The Torch of Certainty, which has been translated into English as The Torch of Certainty and also into French, and which was written by the great Jamgon Kongtrul Rinpoche, Lodro Tai, you will be aware of the fact that this practice is something which goes beyond the main Kagyu lineage, that there is, it is not simply this lineage, this is simply the central lineage that one is focusing on, but one is not excluding the others.
Kadon imate George Pate Artisha, Como Boston Paris, Kadon Samate, Jelama Ozon Papayasan to Japan, Kajus, the Landa Kajus, the Landa of the Jepata Sacharis, John to the Lamachiaris, the John Kachataba, the Jessitarana Talas of the Japanes, and then she did to the Lamachi, the part of Matamala Jenny to Japanese, Chiru to the Lamachi, Nurichi Las Pachumakaji to Lamaris, that I would teach the Jagalamanta, Gone, Jepagone, Della Soata, Maris.
In this text, one can see that while this central lineage of the Kagyu school is described, it is also mentioned that the gurus of other lineages are surrounding this central lineage in the visualization. The gurus of the Mahaati transmission, of the Nyingmapa school, all of the scholars and yogis who have appeared in that lineage. The gurus of the Kadampa school, beginning with Atisha. The gurus of the Gadenpa or Gelugpa school, beginning with Tsongkhapa. The gurus of the what is called the Lamdre transmission, which is the Sakyapa school. The gurus of the Jonangpa lineage. The gurus of the teachings known as Shije and Chu. The teachers of the Shangpa Kagyu and the 6 doctrines of Niguma, and so forth. All of the main 8 transmissions of Buddha Dharma in Tibet are mentioned and are included in the visualization, and one takes refuge in all of these. The reason why this is presented in this way is because while one is going to have a particular connection with a particular lineage that arises from previous karmic connections, one should respect all lineages. And so while one may have a particularly strong connection with one lineage, which is the most important one for one personally, this does not mean that the one does not respect the other lineages of Dharma. And so for this reason, the meditation is presented in this way. At the end of the section of the taking of refuge, which is done with the prostrations, there is a section known as the taking of the Bodhisattva vow. These are the words that we use tonight during the ceremony, and so after every session of taking refuge and doing prostrations, one recites the words of the vow over again 3 times and retakes the Bodhisattva vow. So ideally one could be doing this on a daily basis, continually retaking one's Bodhisattva vow.
Samudra Saparana Samaya Manda Sambadevo Tuzundeje Kumbado Bado Sibana Namkanyam Lendo Gyawa Chunze Dagi Chisaba Tamje Dagi
Wenn jetzt noch der Wunsch besteht, einen Kata zu opfern, ist jetzt Gelegenheit dazu.
Baba Jamba Inge Jamba Tata Kungi Soda Temple Badu Kulai Chabashu Nidashin Kulas Ruation Tabu Tembashu Temple Jama to the Chandam of the Temple Nimo the Jason Tajin Temple Jindachi